This story is a fictional work created for entertainment purposes only. All names, characters, and events are fictional. The first sensation that pulled me out of sleep on my wedding morning was cold air brushing across the top of my head. It was a strange, razor-sharp kind of cold that did not belong inside my childhood bedroom in Lebanon, Missouri. I remember blinking hard in the dim light, thinking maybe the window was open. Then my hand lifted slowly toward my scalp, and everything inside me went silent. Instead of hair, my fingertips slid across bare skin, smooth, chilled, and horrifyingly unfamiliar. I shot upright so fast the mattress protested. My pulse hammered in my ears. My breath hitched. I stumbled toward the mirror on pure instinct, and the woman staring back at me did not look like herself and certainly not like a bride. I had endured the heat of Kuwait patrols, the pressure of escorting detainees, the adrenaline of late-night alerts at Fort Leonard Wood, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the shock of seeing my own reflection stripped of the one thing I had always believed was untouchable. My head was completely shaved. My eyes were swollen and rimmed red. A cheap strip of adhesive tape clung crookedly near my temple like some cruel signature left behind by a coward. And then I saw it, a sticky note pressed to the lower corner of the mirror in the slanted, messy handwriting I knew too well. Now you look like what you truly are, ridiculous. Signed simply, Kyle. My stepbrother, my lifelong storm, my father's favorite excuse, the boy who once smashed my first car with a baseball bat and was told by Dad, boys will be boys. The man who shoved me into the pantry during an argument, and Dad insisted he was only joking. The person I had tried to believe could someday change. My knees almost buckled. I grabbed the dresser to keep myself upright. My wedding makeup kit spilled to the floor with a sharp clatter that sounded far too loud in the quiet room. Shame, humiliation, and something deeper like betrayal wrapped in barbed wire rose inside my chest. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Then the bedroom door swung open, and my heart lurched in panic. I expected Kyle, or worse, I expected my father coming to tell me it was all my fault. But it was Elias, my fiancé, my quiet, steady anchor, a CIA counterintelligence officer who had seen things he never spoke about yet, always carried a calmness that grounded me. He stepped into the doorway and froze, not in shock, but in pain. Real pain for me. "Tessa," he whispered. What happened? My throat worked, but no words formed until he stepped closer, cupped my face with both hands, and asked again, voice deep and slow. "Who did this?" I forced the name out like it weighed 100 pounds. Kyle. Elias inhaled long and controlled, and in that breath something in him shifted. Not rage, resolution. Determination with an edge I had only glimpsed once before. He brushed his thumb over my cheek. "Tessa, today is not canceled. Today is not the day your family breaks you. Today is the day we take everything back." I shook my head, trembling. People will see me like this. They will stare. He leaned in until his forehead touched mine. Let them look. I have a plan. And in that instant, with my life in pieces around me, I felt something spark inside me. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of it, because I suddenly understood one thing. Kyle thought shaving my head would silence me. Today, he would learn what it felt like to fall to his knees in front of everyone who once believed he was harmless. If you have ever been betrayed by someone in your own family, comment, "Yes," so I know I am not alone. 48 hours before my wedding day, I was still convincing myself that everything would be fine. I kept repeating the same sentence in my head like a quiet drill chant meant to steady my breathing. It will be fine. It has to be fine. I had driven from Fort Leonard Wood to Lebanon, Missouri after finishing my last shift with the military police company. 31 years old, a staff sergeant with nearly a decade of service. And yet I still felt 16 the minute I stepped onto my father's property. The gravel driveway, the peeling paint on the porch, the smell of stale cigarettes drifting from the open window, all of it pressed on my chest like an old invisible hand reminding me that I never quite escaped this house. Patrick Callahan. My father had softened physically over the years, but not emotionally. His opinions stayed sharp and heavy, and his temper was still a blade he kept polished. And Kyle, my stepbrother, lived in that shadow like he believed it was his inheritance. Kyle was 30 but had aged faster than me in all the wrong ways. Too much beer, too many nights fighting in parking lots, too many arrests that somehow dissolved because Dad bulldozed through every complaint with the same tired line. He is just misunderstood. Yet I had been the one who left home at 18, joined the army, learned to stand straight, learned to follow orders, learned to keep my voice calm even when someone was screaming in my face. I used to think Dad admired that. Now I wondered if it had only made him resent me more. When Elias and I decided to hold the ceremony in Lebanon, I told myself it was the right thing to do. My father could not travel far, and my aunts and cousins kept saying the family needed something joyful again. I told Elias it would be simple and peaceful, and he gave me the same patient look he always did, the one that suggested he already knew more than I was saying. Elias Ward was nothing like the men I grew up around. He spoke softly but precisely. He watched everything without making people feel watched. And even though he never said much about his role in CIA counterintelligence, I could sense the weight of it in the way he moved. Nothing startled him, nothing rattled him, except maybe my father. I introduced Elias to Patrick and Kyle the evening before the wedding. It was a meeting I had been dreading for months. My father shook Elias' hand stiffly as though he were greeting an unwanted officer sent to inspect his home. Kyle did not even bother hiding his glare. When we sat down in the living room, I could feel the air tighten. The house had always carried its own tension, but that night it felt like something grinding beneath the floorboards. Dad asked Elias about his job, and Elias gave his usual measured answer that he worked in federal analysis. Dad scoffed like the word analysis offended him. Kyle leaned back on the couch, a beer bottle hanging loosely from his fingers. "So Tessa brings home a spy," he muttered. I kept my voice level. "He did not say that, Kyle." Elias only smiled politely and replied, "I am not a spy. I just do my job." His calmness clearly irritated Kyle, who puffed out his chest in that familiar need for dominance. Dad stepped in with a mocking laugh, insisting that no man works for the government without sticking his nose where it does not belong. I watched Elias carefully. His expression did not change. He simply listened, observed. Later that night, when Dad went out to smoke and Kyle disappeared toward the kitchen, I felt Elias stand closer to me like a protective instinct had clicked into place. He murmured quietly, "Tension in this house is not new for you, is it?" I kept my eyes on the window. "It has always been like this." He asked softly, "Does Kyle resent you?" The question hit harder than he knew. Kyle had spent years throwing little daggers my direction. He hated that I joined the army and succeeded. He hated that I kept steady employment and structure while he cycled through jobs and trouble. But what he hated most was something I never earned and never asked for. My father always expected more from me, and Kyle always saw that as favoritism, even though it felt nothing like love. I answered slowly, "Kyle thinks Dad cares about me more." Elias tilted his head. "And do you think that—" I hesitated. "No. Dad cares about control, not about love." Elias did not comment, but the silence said enough. Standing there next to him, I felt a wave of unease crawl through me. It was the same feeling I used to get during patrol briefings when something in the air hinted danger before anyone saw it. I told myself I was imagining it, that this wedding would go smoothly, that Kyle would not cause trouble, that Dad would at least try to behave. But deep down, a voice whispered that trouble was already building, and I was right. Have you ever tried to please a family that never truly valued you? The morning of my wedding began with a strange cold sensation sliding across the top of my head, and for a few suspended seconds I did not understand what I was feeling. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to see the soft shape of my childhood ceiling fan turning above me. Instead, the room looked unfamiliar in the way rooms feel unfamiliar when fear creeps in first and understanding lags behind. A faint breeze moved through the open window, brushing along my scalp again, and this time the cold reached bone deep. My hand rose hesitantly, as if it already knew the truth long before my mind caught up. The instant my fingertips touched bare skin, I felt the world fall sideways. No hair, no slight fuzz, just skin smooth and exposed. I sat up with a violent jerk, and the blanket tangled around my waist as I grabbed the edge of the mattress to steady myself. The wedding dress hanging on the closet door watched me like a silent witness to humiliation. I stumbled to the mirror, already shaking before I saw my reflection. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, her head stripped clean, her eyes wild, her breath trembling in short bursts. A thin, crooked line of adhesive tape clung to one side of my scalp as if the person who did this had used it to pull hair while cutting. My throat closed, and for a moment I could not breathe. Then a memory flickered through my mind with the clarity of a flashbang. Last night, the dull clinking of bottles, Kyle staggering down the hallway muttering that the wedding was a mistake, my father yelling at him to sleep it off, me closing my door and telling myself it would be fine. I remembered lying down after taking a single glass of cheap sparkling wine offered by my aunt. I remembered how heavy my eyelids felt, too heavy, the kind of heaviness that never belonged to one small drink. And then I remembered something else. A creak of the floorboard not far from my bed, the faint smell of beer and sweat, the shadow moving near my dresser. My body had tried to wake fully, but my limbs felt trapped under thick sand. Someone whispered something slurred and hostile. I could not make out the words, but I knew the voice. Kyle. The memory snapped back into silence, and I gripped the dresser while nausea rolled through me. He had done this while I slept, unable to move or defend myself. I felt exposed, violated, and furious all at once. My eyes burned, but I refused to let tears fall. I reached for the closet, grabbed a white scarf, and wrapped it tightly around my head with fingers that could barely stay steady. I kept telling myself I needed a plan before anyone saw me. I needed time. I needed to think. But I had barely begun knotting the scarf when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Firm, measured, familiar. Elias. My heart pounded harder because I did not know how to face him like this. I turned away from the door instinctively, as if hiding would somehow undo the reality in front of me. The doorknob turned, and he stepped inside wearing a simple white shirt. The sleeves rolled neatly the same way he did before every important moment. He looked at me then at the scarf, then at the scattered makeup on the floor, and his expression shifted from confusion to something far darker and far quieter. Tessa. He said gently, "What happened?" I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay upright. "Nothing," I whispered. "I just need a minute." He stepped closer. "I know your voice well enough to hear when you are hurting. Who did this?" I shook my head, but the movement loosened the scarf just enough for a glimpse of raw skin to show. His jaw tightened. "Tessa, please. Tell me." My voice broke as I said the name that tasted like poison. "Kyle." The room went still. Elias inhaled once slowly a breath that signaled not shock but decision. He touched my arm with steady hands and raised my chin until I met his eyes. "We are not letting this ruin today," he said, "not for a single minute." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. "People will see me like this." Elias answered in a calm, low voice that carried the weight of a promise. "Then let them see. We choose how this day ends, not them." He paused, then added with quiet certainty, "I have a plan." Elias did not give me time to collapse under the weight of what had happened. The moment I whispered that Kyle had shaved my head, he reached for my hand and guided me out of the room with a focus that reminded me of the way he briefed urgent operations. His movements were calm, controlled, deliberate. "We are leaving now," he said, and there was no room for argument. I followed him down the hallway, still clutching the edge of the scarf around my head, unable to shake the feeling that everyone in the house could hear my heartbeat pounding hard and uneven. Dad was asleep in his recliner, snoring loud enough to rattle the lampshade. Kyle was nowhere to be seen. The silence made my skin crawl. Elias opened the front door, and the cool Missouri morning air hit me like a shock. The sun was barely rising, casting long, pale shadows across the yard. The world looked normal, which somehow made the horror on my head feel even more surreal. "Where are we going?" I asked as he opened the passenger door of his car. He answered simply, "Rally Point Alpha." I almost laughed because the phrase took me back to my early training days when instructors barked it to make us move faster and stop asking questions. But the seriousness in his eyes told me this was not a joke. He drove toward downtown Lebanon in silence, giving me space to breathe, though every breath felt uneven. I kept one hand on the scarf, terrified it might slip and expose what Kyle had done. Eventually, Elias spoke with that even tone he used when solving a problem piece by piece. Tessa, there is someone here in town who has helped military spouses and veterans who have experienced humiliation or abuse. She knows how to work quickly and carefully. She will help you reclaim the way you present yourself today. I stared out the window, watching storefronts and mailboxes pass in a blur. Abuse. The word echoed. I had always refused to label what happened in my family, but the truth clawed at me now. Maybe I should have called it by its name years ago. We pulled into a small brick building tucked between a hardware shop and a small diner. The sign in the window read, "Simply Grace Salon." I felt my stomach twist. Elias stepped out and opened my door, offering his hand. Inside, a woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her dark hair looked up from sweeping the floor. The moment she saw me, her expression softened with understanding, not shock and not pity. "You must be Tessa," she said gently. "Come sit, honey." Elias had already called ahead. My throat tightened again. I followed her to a chair in front of a large mirror that I could not bear to look into yet. She introduced herself as Grace, a former stylist at Fort Leonard Wood who left base work to help women in the community rebuild confidence after trauma. She spoke kindly but firmly as she untied the scarf. When the fabric fell away, she inhaled slowly and said nothing insulting, nothing dramatic, just a quiet, thoughtful, "All right, we can work with this." She touched my scalp gently, checking for irritation, then began smoothing a light balm that cooled the burning feeling left by the razor. I kept my eyes on my lap until she said, "Look up for me, sweetheart." When I finally did, she had already begun applying a natural makeup palette, making my eyes sharper and my jawline more defined. She added a soft, neutral glow to keep me from looking washed out in photos. Then she opened a small drawer and pulled out a pair of simple gold studs. "Try these," she said. "They draw attention to your face, not your hair." As she clipped them on, I felt something inside me shift slightly, like a cracked bone beginning to realign. Elias stepped back into the room, and his eyes softened when he saw the transformation taking shape. But before he could speak, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression changed. "Tessa," he said quietly. "I just received confirmation from a contact. Kyle recorded himself while he shaved your head." My breath stopped. "The video is already being shared around his drinking group." Heat surged through my chest, a mix of humiliation and fury. Elias slipped his phone into his pocket and knelt so he was eye level with me. "We are taking this to court," he said. "Not someday. Today." When we arrived at the chapel, the parking lot was already full, and the sound of guests gathering drifted through the open doors in scattered waves of voices. My stomach tightened as I stepped out of the car, the autumn air colder than before, brushing against my scarf as if warning me that nothing about this day would be gentle. I took a slow breath, steadied myself, and walked toward the entrance with Elias a step behind me. The chapel was small, built of pale stone, with stained glass windows that glowed softly in the morning light. Normally, I would have found comfort in the familiar sight. Today, it felt like stepping onto a stage where every person in the audience already had an opinion about me. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt dozens of eyes settle on me. Conversations quieted before rising again in hushed whispers that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Some people leaned toward each other, murmuring while glancing in my direction. Others stared openly, confusion mixed with a kind of appalled fascination. I could almost hear the questions forming in their heads. Why was the bride covering her head? What happened to her? Why does she look shaken? Their curiosity pressed against me like a physical weight. I kept my gaze forward and walked with the posture drilled into me during years of military service. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes ahead. Elias walked behind me, radiating calm authority, and behind him came 3 men dressed in simple suits. If anyone looked closely, their bearing revealed what they really were. CIA witnesses. They carried themselves with the quiet attentiveness of people who measured every doorway, every face, every shift in the room. Even without introductions, their presence caused a ripple of unease among the guests. I reached the aisle and forced myself not to touch the scarf again. My fingers twitched to keep checking that it still sat correctly. The thought of it slipping even slightly filled me with a kind of panic that burned behind my ribs. Then I saw my father. Patrick Callahan stood near the front row, puffing his chest as if he were the host of some grand event. His expression was a strange mix of irritation and pride until he noticed me approaching. His eyebrows shot up, and he made a loud, dismissive sound like a scoff. For a moment, I let myself hope that maybe just once he would choose compassion. But compassion was not something he kept in his toolkit. He stepped closer, gripping the back of a pew, and hissed just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "What is all this, Tessa? Why are you making such a scene?" My jaw tightened. Before I could answer, he raised his voice with a forced laugh that echoed through the space. "Kyle said you got upset over a joke. It was just fooling around. He did not shave your whole head. Stop being dramatic." Several guests turned to stare between us, their shock deepening. My throat tightened, but the years of swallowing my voice were over. I met his gaze, silently refusing to play the role he expected. He hated when I was calm. Kyle told him it was only a joke. A joke. My scalp still stung from the razor. I felt my father waiting for me to apologize or make excuses as I had done countless times growing up. Instead, I stepped past him without responding. His hand twitched like he wanted to grab my arm, but Elias moved subtly closer, his presence alone enough to stop the gesture. The witnesses followed us down the aisle, and people shifted uncomfortably as they passed. The murmurs grew sharper. Something was wrong. Something big. I could sense the moment the guests realized this was not a normal wedding and not a minor family disagreement. A woman near the left pew covered her mouth. A man whispered into his wife's ear, and she stiffened. Someone in the back said quietly, "That is not a joke." I reached the front of the chapel and stood there feeling exposed even with the scarf. I sensed Elias behind me, the steady force that kept me upright. The room held a brittle silence now, like everyone waited for something to break. And I knew it would, because Kyle was not here yet. But when he arrived, the truth would follow him like a storm cloud. The moment Kyle entered the chapel, the energy in the room shifted like a sudden drop in air pressure before a storm. He swaggered down the aisle wearing an ill-fitting suit jacket and the smirk of someone who believed he still controlled the story. He looked at me, then at the guests, then at the scarf tied around my head. His smirk widened. I felt the old familiar fear rise inside me, but this time, something stronger pressed against it. Elias stepped forward calm as a man walking into a briefing room, not a wedding aisle, and signaled to the 3 witnesses behind him. The pastor hesitated, clearly confused, but Elias spoke in a steady voice that carried through the chapel. "Before this ceremony continues, there is something that must be addressed." Guests shifted uneasily, turning to look at him, then at Kyle. My father stepped closer, his jaw clenched. Elias reached into a slim black folder and pulled out a small tablet. It was angled so everyone could see the screen. I watched Kyle's expression change in a single heartbeat from amusement to confusion to something close to panic. Elias tapped the screen and the video began to play. The chapel fell silent as grainy footage appeared, showing my bedroom dimly lit in the early morning. My sleeping form lay still under the blanket. Then, the door creaked open and Kyle stumbled inside, holding a pair of electric clippers. Someone in the front row gasped. Another whispered, "Dear God." Kyle's face drained of color. Elias' voice remained even. This recording was taken at 5:14 in the morning, without her consent, without her awareness. My father barked out a loud laugh, a fake one that shook with strain. "This is ridiculous! It is edited! It has to be!" But the video kept playing. Kyle leaned over my sleeping body in the footage and pressed a hand to my head to steady me. He brought the clippers down and the buzzing filled the chapel like a swarm of angry bees. My breath caught as the image showed my hair falling in uneven chunks across the sheet. The sound of laughter echoed from the speaker. Kyle laughter. Drunken, cruel, triumphant. Someone in the chapel whispered, "That is not a joke." Then Elias opened another file. A screenshot of the message Kyle sent to his friends at 3:42 in the morning appeared. The chapel read it in silence. "Watch this. She will not dare get married now." Then a voice recording played, crackling slightly with background noise. Kyle voice again. Slurred. Mocking. "I am going to shave her bald. She will freak out. I bet she calls the whole thing off. I want to see her cry." The recording ended and the chapel was so silent that I could hear my own heartbeat. Kyle took a step backward. His smirk had vanished, leaving something hollow and frightened in its place. My father exploded. "Enough! Stop this! Do not besmirch your own family. You are humiliating your brother on your wedding day." The room erupted in murmurs. Besmirch. Family. Brother. The words twisted like broken glass. I slowly turned to face my father. He looked at me as if I were the one who had done something monstrous, as if my pain were an inconvenience he had to swat away. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Elias stepped between us, not touching my father, not raising his voice, simply presenting the final piece of evidence. He turned the tablet again and displayed something that made even the boldest guests flinch. A time-stamped geolocation map from a device Kyle carried. It verified beyond any argument that he entered my room 3 separate times that night. Elias said quietly, "For the record, this was not a prank. It was premeditated humiliation." My father's face turned red, almost purple. He jabbed a finger toward me. "Why did you bring all this here? Why did you not handle it privately? Why must you try to destroy your brother?" The word destroy struck something inside me that had been waiting years to break free. I stepped around Elias and faced my father directly, though my voice came out softer than I expected. Destroy. Dad, he destroyed something. He destroyed my dignity. He destroyed my trust. He destroyed the one day in my life that was supposed to be safe. My father threw his hands up. "It is hair. It will grow back. Stop making a spectacle." The guests reacted audibly to that. Some shook their heads. Some whispered angrily. One woman from the second row said aloud, "This is not about hair. This is about abuse." Kyle flinched at the word. Abuse. It cut through his drunken bravado like a blade. I looked at him then, at the tablet still frozen on his sneering face. For the first time in years, he seemed small. Not because of what Elias had shown, but because for once he could not control the narrative. Elias turned to me and asked gently, "Tessa, do you want to continue with this ceremony?" Every breath in the chapel held still, waiting for my answer. I looked out at the guests, the stained glass windows, the aisle that suddenly felt less like a path to a wedding and more like a path out of silence. I nodded once, slow and steady. "Yes." "We continue." Kyle stumbled as if the word physically struck him. My father shouted in disbelief. "You will not ruin your brother's life over a misunderstanding." Before I could respond, Elias spoke with calm finality. "There is no misunderstanding, just truth. And truth stands on its own." The pastor cleared his throat. The guests straightened, and I felt something indescribable rise in my chest. Not anger, not vengeance. Something stronger. Relief. For the first time, the truth was not mine alone to carry. If you were in my place, would you walk away or stand and face everything? The silence that followed my decision to continue the ceremony did not feel like peace. It felt like the moment after a pane of glass cracks, but before it shatters. Everyone in the chapel seemed suspended between disbelief and outrage. Then, the murmurs began to rise again, sharper than before. I could hear my aunt whispering to my uncle that video was real. It was not a prank. Another cousin shook her head, staring at Kyle as if she no longer recognized him. A friend of my father, a man who had known our family for decades, muttered, "I cannot believe he would do something like that." And slowly, almost visibly, the room shifted away from Kyle like a tide pulling back from a shoreline. He stood near the aisle, pale and sweating, gripping the edge of a pew as if he needed it to stay upright. His eyes darted from face to face, desperate for support that no longer came. Every person he had once charmed with his loud jokes and exaggerated stories now looked at him with a mixture of disgust and stunned disappointment. One woman who had always coddled him muttered, "I defended him for years." I was wrong. Kyle stared at her as if she had betrayed him. Then his gaze swung toward my father, looking for refuge. Dad straightened as if ready to shield him with his entire body. He puffed himself up, took a step forward, and raised his voice so all could hear. "Everyone calm down. You are all being dramatic. He just got carried away. He was drunk. He did not mean anything by it." Guests exchanged disgusted looks. Some shook their heads. Someone near the back said loudly, "He shaved her head while she slept." "How is that not meant?" My father snapped back. "He is her brother. Siblings fight. There is no need to treat him like a criminal." I felt my heart pound with a different kind of ache. Even now, after undeniable evidence, my father still insisted on protecting Kyle at any cost. It was the story of my entire childhood played out again in front of a full audience. Kyle did something cruel. Dad excused it. I was expected to swallow the hurt and remain silent. But this time, I felt something solid forming inside me, like armor being fitted piece by piece. Elias moved slightly closer, sensing the tension brewing, but he did not speak. He knew this was not his fight. Not this part. My father turned on me, his voice low, but carrying enough strength to fill the chapel. "Tessa, you will apologize to your brother for turning this into a spectacle." My jaw locked. I felt every eye in the chapel shift toward me, waiting to see what I would do. For 31 years, I had chosen silence because it kept the peace, or at least it kept my father from exploding. But peace built on silence is not peace. It is a cage. I stood a little straighter, my voice steady even though my hands trembled. "I will not apologize." My father's face darkened. He stepped closer, invading my space the same way he had done since I was a child when he wanted to make me feel small. He hissed through clenched teeth, "Drop this now." I said nothing, so he repeated louder, "Face your guests and explain that this was all blown out of proportion." My chest tightened, but I did not look away. For the first time, his intimidation did not work. Maybe because the truth was no longer hidden behind closed doors. Maybe because Elias stood behind me like a silent anchor. Maybe because the entire room had seen clearly what had been done to me. I drew in a breath and said the words that had waited decades to be spoken. I do not owe anyone my silence anymore. My father looked as if I had slapped him. The shock spread across his features, then twisted into outrage. Kyle stared at me with pure disbelief, unable to process that the sister he had always been allowed to mock had finally refused to bend. My father tried again to rally the room on his side, raising his hands in frustration. "You all know Kyle. You know he would never hurt his own sister. He is confused. He is stressed. This wedding pushed him too far." But no one responded. No nods, no agreement, no sympathy. People looked away, uncomfortable with his delusion. Some crossed their arms, refusing to indulge him. Others whispered that this family had deeper issues than they realized. One older woman who had watched me grow up said quietly to her husband, "That girl has finally reached her breaking point. And she is right to." The realization settled across my father's shoulders like a weight he could not lift. His power was slipping, his narrative collapsing, his audience no longer willing to play along. Kyle took a shaky step forward, his voice cracking as he tried to speak. "Tessa, come on. Do not act like this was some big thing." But I did not flinch. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "No. You took something from me, and you will answer for it." The chapel held its breath, and for the first time in my life, I felt the entire room standing with me rather than expecting me to fold. The pastor stood frozen at the front of the chapel, holding his small leather-bound book as if unsure whether to lift it or close it. The silence stretched so long that even the sunlight spilling through the stained glass seemed to hesitate. Finally, he cleared his throat, a soft, careful sound that echoed louder than expected in the charged room. "Tessa," he said gently, "we do not have to continue this ceremony under these circumstances. No one will fault you if you choose to pause or step outside." His voice carried compassion, not pity, and that alone steadied me. I felt every set of eyes waiting on me, watching for a sign that I might break, or run, or crumble. But instead, I felt a sudden firmness inside, like the moment your feet finally root after sliding on ice. I looked at the pastor. Then I looked at Elias, who met my gaze with quiet, unwavering assurance. Then at the guests, whose faces held shock and sympathy and something else I had not expected. Respect. I inhaled slowly, letting the breath fill the hollow space in my chest. Today is not about hair. I said, my voice surprisingly clear. Today is about freedom. A ripple passed through the room. Even the pastor blinked as if he needed a moment to absorb the weight of what I had just said. My father scoffed loudly, but his objection fell flat in the middle of a crowd no longer willing to absorb his dismissiveness. The pastor nodded once, and his expression settled into calm resolve. "Very well," he said softly. "If you wish to continue, then we will honor that." He gestured for everyone to return to their seats. There was a shuffle of movement as guests sat down, murmuring to one another in low tones. I walked toward the front, the aisle stretching before me like a path reclaimed. The church looked different now, not as a place where something terrible had been revealed, but as a place where something long suppressed had finally surfaced. The stained glass windows cast warm colors over the pews, crimson, blue, gold, like reminders that beauty could still exist even in moments of deep hurt. I felt Elias join me, and the warmth of his presence steadied the small tremor in my hand. He had not spoken since my declaration, but he did not need to. His silence was a pledge. The pastor opened his book again and began the ceremony. At first, the words felt distant, like I was hearing them from underwater. But as he continued, I felt myself realigning with the moment, choosing to be present rather than stolen from. When he asked if anyone objected to the union, the entire chapel fell silent. Not one whisper, not one cough. Even my father's mouth opened then closed as he realized he no longer had an audience for his outrage. Kyle stood in the corner, trembling with barely restrained anger or shame or both, but he said nothing. No one would have listened, even if he tried. The pastor turned to Elias, who responded firmly and without hesitation, affirming his vows with a voice that carried strength and tenderness in equal measure. Then it was my turn. When I repeated the words, I felt something surprising. They did not feel tainted by the morning. They felt reclaimed, as if speaking them now in the presence of the truth made them more authentic than they would have been in any perfect, unbroken morning. The guests watched with a kind of reverence I had not expected. They knew what had happened. They had witnessed cruelty, but they were also witnessing resistance. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, a quiet murmur of emotion moved through the room. There was applause, but not the light, joyful kind of a typical wedding. It was heavier, more meaningful, carrying a weight that acknowledged both pain and triumph. Elias took my hands gently and kissed me with a tenderness that steadied the last shaking fragment of my spirit. I felt a warmth spread across my chest, not from the kiss itself, but from knowing that the worst had already happened and I had not collapsed. I had stood. We walked down the aisle together. This time, no one whispered. They watched with something closer to awe than curiosity. As we stepped into the sunlight outside the chapel, the breeze that touched my scarf no longer felt cruel. It felt like release. The reception hall should have felt like a refuge after everything that happened in the chapel. But when Elias and I stepped inside, I sensed immediately that the atmosphere was strange. People were gathered in small clusters, whispering not with judgment as before, but with a kind of stunned sympathy. The music played softly in the background, though no one was dancing. The buffet trays sat untouched. The wedding cake glistened under soft yellow lights, yet not a single slice had been cut. It felt as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the energy to settle. But there was one unmistakable detail. Kyle was gone. The moment I noticed his absence, a hollow feeling spread through my chest. Not fear exactly, but a wary instinct I had learned long before my years in the military. It is the silence after an attack that keeps you looking over your shoulder. Elias scanned the room with a sharpened gaze, clearly arriving at the same conclusion. Kyle did not vanish to collect himself. He vanished because he was planning something. We walked a little farther into the room, and guests began approaching us, offering gentle smiles and quiet affirmations. A family friend squeezed my hand, saying, "I am proud of you for standing up for yourself." Another woman pressed a napkin into my palm as if expecting me to cry, though surprisingly, I no longer felt tears rising. A group of cousins hugged me one at a time, whispering that they had no idea what I had endured growing up. A retired neighbor who had known Kyle since childhood shook his head, muttering, "That boy has been headed for trouble for years." It was strange hearing people speak truths that no one had dared acknowledge before today. As more guests approached offering kindness, I felt something warm begin to take place inside me, something I had rarely felt in my own family. Support. Real, unconditional support that did not require me to shrink myself to earn it. But even as I accepted their comfort, my thoughts kept drifting back to the empty chair where Kyle had briefly sat before disappearing into whatever dark idea he was forming. My father made his entrance into the reception with all the fury of a man who believed himself wronged. He stormed in so quickly that the doors banged against the walls. His face was flushed deep red, and he moved with the heavy stomping steps of someone searching for a target. He looked at me first, then at Elias, then at the guests who dared stand between him and his version of events. "You made a fool of this family," he shouted loud enough that the music cut off as the coordinator rushed to silence it. "You let that man parade lies in front of everyone." The guests stiffened. A few stepped protectively closer to me, which only infuriated my father more. He slammed his hand on a nearby table, rattling glasses and plates. "You think this is strength, Tessa? You humiliated your own brother." My voice came out steady. "No, Dad," I revealed the truth. He glared so hard his eyes looked like they might burst with the effort. "You will regret choosing outsiders over your own blood." He looked directly at Elias when he said it, the words dripping with accusation. Elias remained calm, but his posture changed almost imperceptibly, his awareness heightening. My father muttered something under his breath, then shoved a chair aside and stormed out of the hall, leaving a trail of tension behind him. The door slammed so loudly that several guests flinched. For a moment, the room stayed frozen, unsure how to recover. Then my aunt gently touched my shoulder. "Honey, do not let him take this moment from you. You did the right thing." People nodded around her, forming a small circle of encouragement that eased the sting my father always managed to inflict. I thanked them quietly, though my mind continued tracing a single thread. Where was Kyle? The reception coordinator approached hesitantly, saying she had seen him earlier pacing outside near the parking lot before he disappeared behind the building. Elias caught my eye, and I saw recognition flash across his face. Not relief, not reassurance. Recognition, the kind that comes when someone who has observed danger for a living spots the pattern of a person who refuses to accept consequences. He moved a step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Kyle is not done. Not by a long shot." Something in me tightened. It was the same instinct that rose during patrol training, the sense that trouble was no longer hypothetical but imminent. I looked toward the exit where my father had disappeared, and beyond that, the darkness gathering around the building. The day was not over. Not yet. And the storm Kyle carried was still circling, waiting for its next opening. The morning after the wedding should have been quiet, filled with leftover flowers and the soft glow of newlywed calm. But instead, I woke to the sharp-focused energy of a mission briefing. Elias sat at the small kitchen table in our temporary rental, flipping through documents with the same intensity I had seen him use when preparing a counterintelligence report. The air smelled of coffee and determination. When I stepped into the room wrapped in a robe and still exhausted from the emotional chaos of the previous day, he looked up and his expression softened, but the resolve in his eyes remained solid. "Tessa," he said, "we are moving forward." It was not a question. I sat across from him and he slid a folder toward me. Inside were printouts, screenshots, and a neatly organized series of time-stamped files. Video evidence. The recording of Kyle entering my room. The messages he sent to his friends. The audio clip of him laughing about shaving my head. Every piece arranged like puzzle parts fitting into a complete picture. I felt my stomach twist, but I did not look away. I refused to let shame bury me again. Elias continued, I sent the material to a contact who specializes in legal coordination for civilian cases involving military families. He said this is valid for civil court and for a temporary restraining order. The words restraining order made something inside me unclench with recognition, not fear, relief. The idea of finally drawing a boundary with legal backing felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. I nodded slowly. What happens next? Elias hesitated in the deliberate way he did when delivering news that required gentleness. Kyle has been served with a subpoena. The paper filing requires him to appear in St. Louis County Court within 7 days. He watched my reaction carefully, assessing whether the reality was too much too soon. It was startling, yes, but also necessary. I had walked through the fire already. Now came the structure that followed. I asked quietly, "Is he aware?" Elias opened another folder. According to the process server, yes. He did not take it well. A small, humorless laugh escaped me. Of course he did not. Kyle had never handled consequences well. When we were children, he blamed me when his bike tire burst. When we were teenagers, he blamed me when he crashed dad truck. As adults, he blamed me for his spiraling life because facing his own choices was too much work. This subpoena, though, was not something he could yell away or charm his way through. The doorbell rang. I felt a jolt, but Elias stood first, moving with the controlled readiness he always carried. When he opened the door, a woman in a navy blazer stepped inside, holding a slim briefcase. She introduced herself as Attorney Karen Whitmore, a specialist in civil protective cases for military families in Missouri. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp but kind. She set her briefcase on the table and looked at me with a steady, unflinching expression. "Mrs. Ward, I want you to understand something from the outset. What happened to you was not a prank. It was assault, humiliation, and violation of personal space and bodily autonomy." Her clarity shook me more than I expected. To hear someone state what I had tried to minimize for years forced the truth to settle even deeper inside me. She continued, "This is not only about the shaving. This is about repeated intimidation and emotional harm. We are filing for a temporary restraining order today." I nodded again, feeling both numb and electrified. Attorney Whitmore reviewed every piece of evidence with a calm, methodical approach. The video footage, the threats, the fact that Kyle entered my room without permission while I was unconscious. She highlighted legal terms that made my throat tighten. Trespass, harassment, intent to cause emotional distress. When she finished, she looked at me as if waiting for a question I had not yet realized I needed to ask. "What if he ignores the subpoena?" She replied simply. Then a warrant follows. The seriousness of her tone left no room for doubt. This was no longer family drama. This was a legal process that Kyle could not bulldoze with anger or excuses. After she left, I walked onto the small porch outside, letting the cool Missouri breeze move across my skin. The sky was pale blue, streaked with wisps of morning clouds. A new day. A hard day, but one moving towards something that resembled justice. Elias joined me, leaning on the railing beside me. "How are you holding up?" I exhaled slowly. "I am tired, but I am ready." He nodded without looking away from the road, as if expecting movement. Trouble. A car, maybe. A shadow of someone watching. Kyle would not let this go easily, and both of us knew it. But for the first time, I also knew something else. He could no longer touch me without consequence. The law had entered the battlefield, and Kyle had just been given his first order to appear, whether he liked it or not. The days leading up to the hearing moved both too quickly and unbearably slow, like time itself could not decide whether to drag me through dread or shove me toward resolution. Every morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach, a pulse of anxiety that beat against my ribs, as if reminding me that facing a courtroom meant facing the truth again and again until it hardened into something I could stand on. Yet beneath the fear, there was a steadiness growing roots inside me. I knew this was necessary. I knew I could not let what Kyle did disappear into the usual family fog of excuses and minimization. Elias treated those days like preparation for a controlled operation. He sat with me at the kitchen table, reviewing how testimony worked, what I would likely be asked, and how to keep my tone steady. When you speak, he said gently, look at the judge, not Kyle. You are not here to convince him. You are here to present facts. He helped me practice breathing techniques that military instructors had drilled into us during high-stress exercises. In one breath hold, for 4, release, for 4. Again. Keep your shoulders low. You command the space you stand in. His patience steadied me more than the techniques. Every time I faltered, he reminded me that truth was not fragile and that I had nothing to hide or apologize for. But anxiety has a way of creeping in through cracks you did not know were there. Sometimes at night I found myself replaying the video in my head, the buzzing clippers, the sight of my own hair falling. I reminded myself that the courtroom was not a battlefield where chaos ruled. It was a place where the truth was given structure and weight. Still, the nights were hardest. The mornings were not easy either, and then came the intrusion I should have expected but still felt caught off guard by. My father began calling. At first, once a day, then twice, then relentlessly. I ignored the first few calls, but the messages grew more insistent and angrier, until finally one afternoon I answered. His voice came through sharp and impatient. Tessa, this has gone on long enough. You need to drop this before it gets out of hand. Out of hand. I felt my stomach twist. Dad Kyle shaved my head while I slept. He broke into my room and humiliated me. This is not something I can ignore. My father snorted as if the situation were embarrassing only to him. He was drunk. He was jealous. He did something stupid. He is your brother. Sit down with him. Work it out. Do not drag our name into a courtroom. The familiar pressure pushed at my chest, the old instinct to shrink, to keep the peace, to swallow my pain so others would not have to face it. But this time, the instinct did not win. I spoke calmly, surprising even myself. Dad, this is not about jealousy. It is about accountability. His voice snapped back. Accountability. You want to talk about accountability. You always think you are better than him. You always push him too far. That was the same script I had heard my whole life, and hearing it now not only hurt, but clarified something inside me. He was not defending Kyle because he believed him. He was defending Kyle because admitting the truth meant admitting he had allowed this behavior to grow in our home unchecked for years. I answered quietly, I am not dropping the case. There was a long, tense silence, and then he said something that made the air around me feel heavier. If you do this, you will tear this family apart. The words were meant to scare me back into silence, but they had the opposite effect. The family had been torn long before I filed anything. And for the first time, I was choosing to stop stitching over the damage. When the call ended, I sat on the couch breathing slowly, letting the echo of his anger fade. Elias came over handing me a warm mug of tea and sat beside me without asking what had happened. He knew, and the steadiness of his presence helped anchor me again. Court day was coming. I was scared, yes, but I was also ready. Ready to stand, ready to speak, ready to finally stop being the one who absorbed the harm in silence. Do you think I should forgive or continue taking this to court? The morning of the hearing carried the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the world knows something heavy is about to break open. When Elias and I walked into the St. Louis County Courthouse, my pulse thudded through my ears in slow, deep beats. The waiting area buzzed with quiet voices, but the moment people recognized Kyle and me, the whispers shifted into sharper tones, curiosity, suspicion, and the unmistakable awareness that a family fracture was about to unfold in public. Kyle arrived flanked by my father and a public defender he clearly met only minutes before. He walked with a puffed chest, his jaw tight, as if trying to convince everyone that he was the victim in the situation. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on me, wrapped in a formal jacket hair still growing back under a neatly tied scarf. His lip curled in disdain. He muttered something loud enough for me to hear. "This is a joke. She is making a joke out of all of this." My father clapped him on the shoulder, encouraging him with a nod, as if they were entering a sports tryout instead of a courtroom where the truth waited on record. When the bailiff called our case, we stepped inside the courtroom where the judge sat with a posture that commanded silence. The walls felt colder, the air heavier. Kyle swaggered to his seat like he owned the room. I could see the slight tremor in his hands, though. He knew what was coming, but he hoped bluster would drown out evidence. As the proceedings began, Kyle attorney attempted to paint the incident as a silly drunken mistake between siblings, a lapse in judgment, a misguided prank. He even gestured toward me, accusing me of exaggeration. Before the judge could respond, Attorney Whitmore, our counsel, rose and approached the bench with a calmness so sharp it could cut steel. "Your Honor," she began, "this was not a prank. This was premeditated humiliation accompanied by threats, trespass, and repeated acts of intimidation." The judge nodded for her to continue. She motioned to Elias, who stood and approached with a small secure drive. "Your Honor, this contains the original time-stamped video captured by a device in Ms. Callahan room. It also contains the threatening messages and a recorded admission from the defendant." The judge accepted the file and ordered it played. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and I felt my breath seize as the footage filled the screen. The grainy video showed me asleep, helpless, unaware. It showed Kyle entering with the clippers. It showed hair falling. It played the drunken laughter and the mocking lines he spoke with disgusting glee. A ripple of shock passed through the room. People shifted in their chairs. A woman gasped. Even the judge's eyebrows lifted. Kyle's face turned from cocky to terrified, his hands clenched as if he wanted to rip the monitor from the wall. His attorney froze, unable to defend what everyone had just witnessed. When the video ended, the judge leaned forward and asked the defense if they wished to respond. Kyle erupted before his attorney could answer, slamming his fist onto the table. "This is crap," he shouted. "She always thinks she is better than me. She deserved it. She had it coming since we were kids." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The judge glared over her glasses. "Watch your language and your behavior, or you will be removed from this courtroom." My father stood abruptly, trying to fix the mess with the same tired excuses. "Your Honor, Kyle is not himself. He was provoked. He is under stress. This family does not need court. We need peace." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Please sit. You are not counsel." His face reddened as he dropped into his seat. Then came the moment that sealed everything. Elias rose with deliberate calm and held out a small device. "Your Honor, with the court permission, I would like to submit an audio clip obtained legally from a source present the night before the wedding." The judge allowed it. Elias pressed play. Kyle's voice filled the courtroom, dripping with hostility. "I swear I will shave her again, right before she walks out there. I want her so humiliated she cancels it in front of everyone." His laughter followed, cruel, triumphant. The sound echoed like a confession carved into stone. Kyle snapped. He lunged to stand, yelling at Elias, calling him a liar and worse. The bailiff stepped forward, hand resting near his belt, ready to intervene. "Sit down," the judge commanded, her voice booming. Kyle froze, then slowly sank to his knees, not in obedience but in defeat. Like the weight of evidence had finally crushed the arrogance out of him. His voice cracked. "Please, Your Honor." "I did not mean for it to go that far. I was drunk. I was angry. Please do not ruin my life." I saw my father collapse back into his seat, his face ashen, his confidence gone. He looked at Kyle with disbelief, finally forced to confront the truth he spent decades shielding himself from. The judge exhaled slowly. "Mr. Callahan, the court finds substantial evidence of trespass harassment and intentional infliction of emotional harm. You will complete mandatory counseling community service and pay damages to the plaintiff. Any violation of the restraining order will result in immediate jail time." The gavel struck. Kyle's head hung low, shoulders sagging, knees still pressed to the floor. I felt no triumph, only release. For the first time, my pain had been recognized by an authority my father could not argue with, and that recognition felt like the beginning of something I had never truly been allowed to own: justice. The hours after the verdict felt surreal, as if the courthouse hallway existed in a world slightly out of step with reality. People passed by, speaking in hushed tones. Doors opened and closed with soft clicks, and somewhere far off, a security radio crackled, but all of it sounded muted like noise underwater. My hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally being heard. Kyle had been sentenced to probation, mandatory counseling, and community service with a strict restraining order that kept him far away from me and from any place I lived or worked. The judge's words replayed in my mind as if someone whispered them against my ear. Accountability is not cruelty. Accountability is care for the community. Accountability is protection for the future. For years, I had tried to explain that very idea to my father, but he had always dismissed it, believing that family status should neutralize consequences. Now the court had handed down what he never allowed himself to see. As Elias and I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, I felt the weight of the last 24 hours settle into something strangely light, almost bearable. The courthouse steps were warm beneath my shoes, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to close my eyes and breathe in the fresh Missouri air that tasted of fall leaves and distant wood smoke. That moment lasted only a few seconds because I heard footsteps behind us, heavy, hurried, irritated. My father. He stormed toward me with the same explosive energy he had carried into the reception, except now there was something else behind it. Fear, maybe. Or the crumbling realization that the story he had used to justify everything no longer held power. He stopped in front of me and pointed a shaking finger at my chest, his voice cracking with fury. "Do you see what you have done?" he demanded. "You dragged your own brother into court like he was some criminal. You destroyed his name. You destroyed this family." The words snapped through the air like brittle branches. Elias shifted slightly, stepping closer, but I touched his arm, a silent reassurance that I needed to face this myself. My father continued pacing in short, jerky strides. "I told you he was jealous. I told you he did not mean it. But you would not let it go. You wanted to punish him. You embarrassed us in front of the entire town." I felt the old familiar ache pressing against my ribs, the instinct to fold in on myself, the instinct drilled into me since childhood. But it no longer had a home in my body. Something stronger had taken its place, and it rose inside me with a clarity that surprised even me. I answered him quietly but firmly. "Dad, I did not shave anyone's head. I did not break into any one room. I did not record myself humiliating another person. I did not send out videos bragging about it. All I did was tell the truth." He froze mid-step, his mouth opening, then closing like he had forgotten how to speak. The silence stretched between us, sharp and exposed. My voice did not waver. "You are angry at the wrong person. He is responsible for what he did, not me. You cannot blame me for refusing to carry his mistakes on my shoulders anymore." My father face twisted into something pained and defensive. "You could have handled this quietly. You could have kept it in the family." I shook my head. "No. Keeping it in the family is what allowed this to grow in the first place. Silence is how you both kept control. Silence is how you taught me to endure instead of protect myself. Silence is what let him hurt me for years. I am done being silent." He looked around as if searching for support from strangers who wanted nothing to do with his denial. He lowered his voice, but it still trembled with rage. "You think you are so righteous because the court believed you. You think you won something here." I took a slow breath, gathering every piece of strength left in me. "I do not need to win," I said. "I just need to be safe." That broke something in him. His shoulders sagged for a moment, then stiffened as if he forced himself to stay angry because anger was easier than understanding. He pointed toward the parking lot where Kyle had been escorted out earlier to complete paperwork. "Your brother is suffering now because of you. Remember that." He turned to walk away, but something in me refused to let his last words stand. Suffering is not the same as consequences. Kyle choices did this. Not me. For once, he did not have a comeback. He walked off quickly, shoulders, rigid hands shaking. I watched him disappear across the lot and felt the hollow grief of losing a parent long before you admit they were lost. A quiet fell over me, not sadness exactly, but something like acceptance. The kind that wraps itself around old wounds and says, "You survived this. You can let it go now." Elias stepped beside me, warm, steady, solid. He did not try to fix the moment or fill it. He simply waited until my breathing matched the rhythm of the wind moving across the courthouse lawn. Eventually, he asked softly, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. About the courtroom, the evidence, Kyle falling to his knees, my father blame. Then I answered with the truth. Lighter. Not healed, not whole, but lighter. Elias nodded as if that was the most reasonable thing in the world. "It is a beginning," he said. "Not the end." I knew he was right. Justice was not a finish line. It was a door, and for the first time, it was open. 3 months passed in a way that felt both fast and strangely suspended, as if life were trying to stitch itself back together while still leaving the scar clearly visible. My days at Fort Leonard Wood settled into a steady rhythm of training drills, physical conditioning, security briefings, and the occasional transport assignment. The routine gave my mind something firm to stand on, something predictable after months of chaos. The restraining order meant Kyle could not contact me, could not come near my home or workplace, could not text or call without violating probation. It should have felt final, but I had known him my entire life, and I knew that some people do not understand boundaries, even when the court draws them in bold ink. Still, I let myself believe for a short while that maybe he would stay away. Maybe accountability and mandatory counseling would force him to confront the truth he had spent years refusing to see. Then, on a quiet Saturday morning, while Elias was away in Washington for a briefing and I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard a hesitant knock at the front door. Not loud, aggressive pounding, a soft, uneven tap. My first reaction was caution. I checked the peephole. What I saw made my breath freeze. Kyle, standing alone on my porch, wearing wrinkled clothes and a look that hovered somewhere between desperation and calculation. My first instinct was to call the police because even his presence here violated the restraining order, but something in his posture made me pause. Not sympathy. Something sharper. Awareness. This was a moment that had been building for decades, and I wanted to face it with my eyes open, not from behind a closed door. I unlocked the door but did not open it fully. I kept one boot braced against the frame like MPs are trained to do in uncertain encounters. I spoke through the narrow space. "You are not allowed to be here." His shoulders slumped, but not in shame. More like a performance of shame. "Come on, Tess, just hear me out." I kept my expression still. "You are violating a court order." He ran a hand through his unwashed hair, shaking his head as if I were being unreasonable. "I have been going to counseling. I have been doing the stupid community service. I am trying. I really am. I just need you to understand how messed up things were for me." I felt a bitter heat rise in my chest. He was already shifting responsibility away from himself, just like always. Kyle continued. "Look, I know I made some mistakes, but Dad said you would not talk to him either. He says you are the one keeping the family broken." There it was. The old manipulation wrapped in a new desperate tone. I opened the door another inch, not enough for him to step in, but enough to meet his eyes fully. My voice came out calm and steady. "You did not come here to apologize. You came here to rewrite the story." His face twitched. "Tess, this is hard for me too. You have no idea what counseling is like. They make me talk about childhood stuff. They make me say things out loud. They make me take responsibility. It is awful." I stared at him in disbelief. "You think accountability is awful? Try waking up on your wedding day with no hair. Try walking into a courtroom to speak about your own humiliation while the people who raised you defend the person who hurt you. Try that and then tell me counseling is awful." He looked away, muttering something I could not hear. When he looked back, his expression had changed. Softer, almost pleading. "I just want things to go back to normal." Normal. The word echoed through me with a clarity that made my spine straighten. I realized in that moment that normal was exactly what had kept me trapped for years. Normal meant silence. Normal meant absorbing his anger. Normal meant being the forgiving sister while he remained the destructive brother. Normal meant continuing a cycle that had already taken enough from me. I shook my head. "There is no going back." He stepped closer instinctively, and I held up my hand. "Do not move another inch. You are already breaking the law by being here." He froze, but his voice sharpened with frustration. "So that is it. You are done with us, with the whole family." I felt the answer rise with a kind of quiet certainty that did not tremble. I said no. I am done with the version of the family that expected me to shrink so you could take up all the space you wanted. His jaw tightened. You are really choosing them over me. I let out a slow breath. I am choosing myself. He stared at me for a long time. Then his face shifted into the expression I had seen 100 times after he had been caught doing something wrong. The mix of guilt, fear, resentment, and the unwillingness to truly change. He whispered, "Just tell the court you do not need the order anymore." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Why would I do that? Because he said, voice rising, "Dad cannot take it. The neighbors talk. People look at him weird. He is falling apart." I felt the truth settle deeper. Kyle had not come for healing. He had come because accountability made him uncomfortable and he wanted me to take the burden back. "No," I said clearly. "I will not lift the order." He stared at me stunned, as if the refusal had never occurred to him as a possibility. "Tess, please, say something else. Say you forgive me." I looked at him the way you look at someone you finally see clearly after years of distortion. My answer came out steady and final. "You chose to hurt me. I choose to leave that cycle." His mouth opened, but no words formed. For the first time in our lives, he seemed genuinely speechless. I reached for my phone. "You need to go, now, before this becomes another charge." He hesitated for one last lingering second, then turned and walked down the steps, shoulders hunched, not with remorse, but with the weight of consequences he could not manipulate away. When he reached the sidewalk, he glanced back as if expecting me to chase him like I used to when we were younger, desperate to fix what he broke. I did not move. I watched him disappear down the street and felt something inside me settle into place. A boundary, a truth, a breaking of an old script. I closed the door and locked it. For once, the sound did not feel like shutting someone out. It felt like letting myself in. In the months that followed Kyle's sentencing, I expected distance from my father, but I did not expect the slow unraveling that spread through his life like a quiet storm tearing down everything he thought was unshakable. At first, he acted as if the court ruling was a temporary embarrassment, something he could outwait, the way he had outweighted every other moment of accountability in his life. He told neighbors that the judge had overreached and that I had been influenced by Elias, who he claimed manipulated the situation for his own agenda. He told coworkers at the automotive shop that Kyle was the victim and that I had exaggerated what had happened because I had become too rigid from military life. But Lebanon, Missouri is a small place and people talk. The video evidence from the case was sealed, but the testimony was not, and the details drifted through church hallways, grocery aisle whispers, and front porch conversations. People who once nodded politely at my father began stepping around him or cutting conversations short. Even the men he drank with began looking uneasy, because no matter what story he tried to sell them, they could not shake the fact that Kyle had crept into my room while I slept and shaved my head the morning of my wedding, then laughed about it. There are some actions that even the most forgiving community cannot excuse. My father tried doubling down. He attended every veteran meetup in town, speaking louder than everyone else as if volume could restore his credibility. He told anyone who would listen that Kyle was under stress, that boys will be boys, that I was always too sensitive, that things had gone too far, only because agencies like the CIA always want to make examples out of families. He said these things often enough that he convinced himself they were true. But denial is a flimsy foundation, and eventually it cracked. The first real fracture happened at church on a Sunday morning when he tried to speak for the first time during an open prayer request. He stood up, cleared his throat, and began talking about how families fall apart when daughters forget their place. A woman I had known since childhood, a woman who once taught my Sunday school, stood up mid-sentence and walked out. Several others followed. My father stared after them stunned, as if he had only just realized that he no longer had an audience willing to shield him from truth. After that, people grew colder still. Customers at the shop requested other mechanics. He lost his spot on the rotating volunteer list for community events, which he always believed was his right. Even the men he played darts with stopped inviting him. It was not punishment, it was consequence. And consequence has a gravity he had never experienced until now. In late December, I received the first letter. The envelope was thin, the handwriting uneven. He wrote that he was sorry for how things had turned out and sorry that our family looked broken, but the apology was wrapped in blame. He said he wished I had handled things quietly. He said public humiliation was not necessary. He said a daughter should protect her family name even when things get messy. He wrote 3 pages without ever acknowledging what he and Kyle had actually done. No ownership, no accountability, just regret for how the world perceived him. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I did not respond. In January, another letter arrived. This one claimed he missed me, that he could not sleep, that I had always been the best of him. But then, in the next paragraph, he explained that men like Kyle act out because they feel threatened by strong women, and that it was my responsibility to understand that dynamic instead of making it worse. Again, no accountability. Just a new way to shift the burden onto me. I did not respond to that letter either. Elias read them both with a steady expression and asked only once, "Are you sure silence is what you want?" I nodded because silence was not cruelty, it was protection. My healing. In February, my father tried one last time. The third letter arrived thicker than the others. He wrote that he wanted forgiveness, but still never admitted what actually happened. He wrote that he wanted to rebuild, but never said he was willing to change. He wrote that he loved me, but still framed Kyle as a troubled boy instead of a grown man who had chosen to hurt me. By the last sentence, I realized something that settled into my bones with calm certainty. Forgiveness cannot grow in soil where truth is not planted, and my father refused truth, so I chose distance. Not punishment, not spite. Just distance, the quiet kind that allows healing to take root. I placed the letter in a drawer with the others but did not answer. That evening, while standing on the small balcony outside our home at Fort Leonard Wood, I watched the winter air drift over the training fields and felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace. Losing a parent while they are still alive is a particular kind of grief, but allowing myself to step away from a man who never protected me felt like reclaiming the parts of myself he had tried for years to silence. Some families fall not because one person walks away, but because the foundation was cracked from the beginning. I was finally far enough from the dust to see it clearly, and I chose not to step back into the collapse. Moving back to Fort Leonard Wood felt like stepping into a different version of myself, one that had been waiting quietly beneath the chaos for years. The base had always held a strange kind of comfort for me, the familiar cadence of morning formations, the echo of boots on pavement, the steady rhythm of discipline and purpose. But returning now with Elias felt different. It felt intentional, like choosing not just a place, but a new beginning. Our house on post was small, but warm with soft light in the evenings and the faint hum of military life outside the windows. For the first few weeks, I woke up with tension already in my shoulders, half expecting another crisis, another phone call, another letter from my father. Healing is not a straight line, and mine began with a kind of exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. At Elias' urging, I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in military family trauma. I remember sitting in the small, quiet office for the first time, staring at the neutral walls, feeling strangely out of place. I had faced hostile detainees in Kuwait, mediated violent domestic disputes on base, and handled emergencies with calm precision. Yet talking about my own pain felt like walking into unfamiliar terrain. The counselor asked me simple questions at first. Questions about the wedding incident, about my father, about Kyle, about the years of tension long before the court case. I realized quickly that I had spent decades excusing behavior that would never be considered acceptable in any other context. I had been trained to absorb impact quietly to make myself smaller for the sake of family peace. In the military, we are taught to hold the line, but no one tells you how heavy that line can become when it stretches into your personal life. Week by week, I felt layers of guilt loosen. I had spent so long believing that setting boundaries meant betraying the family that raised me. But therapy taught me that loyalty without safety is not loyalty at all. One session in particular stayed with me. The counselor asked, "When did you first feel responsible for keeping the peace in your home?" Without thinking, I answered, "When I was 12. The words hung in the air, and something inside me cracked quietly. I had been carrying responsibilities that were never mine to carry, and I had mistaken that burden for love. Elias never rushed my process. He created space for it. Some nights we would sit on the back steps watching the Missouri sky fade into dusk. He would listen more than he spoke, letting me sort through memories I had kept buried for years. There were moments when grief hit unexpectedly, like when I saw a father and daughter at the commissary laughing together, or when I received a holiday flyer in the mail and realized how much I dreaded the idea of going home. There were moments of anger too sharp and hot and undeniable, but slowly there were moments of peace. I started running again, something I had stopped doing regularly during the stress of the wedding and court case. The trail winding behind the training fields became my early morning ritual, a place where the air felt clean enough to breathe without pressure. I began journaling at night, writing down the thoughts that knotted in my mind so they would not follow me into sleep. I met with younger female MPs during training cycles, offering the kind of support I once wished someone had offered me. Each conversation made me realize how many women carry invisible battles and how powerful it can be to say, "You are not the only one." One evening after a long session of sorting through childhood memories, I looked in the bathroom mirror at the hair beginning to grow back across my scalp. The new growth was soft, uneven, and stubborn, like fresh beginnings often are. I ran my fingers over it, and for the first time I did not think of Kyle, or the wedding morning, or the humiliation. I thought of resilience, of choosing my life rather than surviving someone else's choices. Elias stepped into the doorway, watching me with that steady gaze of his, and said quietly, "You look stronger every day." For once, I believed him. Healing was not quick, and it was not simple, but it was mine. And each day I lived a little further away from the belief that I owed my family pain in exchange for belonging. I no longer felt guilty for building a life that my father had not envisioned. I no longer felt responsible for Kyle's choices. My life was my own, and claiming it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. By early summer, something in me had shifted so gradually, I almost missed the moment it became undeniable. My confidence did not come back all at once like a door swinging open. It arrived in small, quiet ways, a steadier breath during formations, a calmer mind during high-pressure drills, a voice that no longer hesitated when giving commands. My chain of command noticed. My captain pulled me aside after a field exercise and told me my leadership had sharpened with a clarity he rarely saw. I had always been competent, but now there was something else grounding me, a sense of ownership not just over my duties, but over myself. A month later, I was promoted and assigned as a training lead for incoming female MPs, a position I had admired for years but never imagined holding so soon. Standing in front of a group of young women on their first day of orientation, I saw flickers of myself in each of them. Some carried the rigid posture of people who grew up tiptoeing around explosive tempers. Some spoke softly, with eyes that scanned for danger even in a safe room. Some asked questions with the hesitancy of someone who had never been allowed to take up space. I recognized the signs because I had lived them. My role was not just to teach regulations, procedures, and tactical control measures. It was to teach them how to hold their ground without apologizing for existing. During one morning briefing, a recruit named Martinez faltered during a scenario assessment, clearly shaken by a memory she did not share. After class, she approached me almost whispering, "Sergeant Callahan, how did you learn to not feel responsible for everything?" The question hit with a familiarity that tightened my chest. I sat with her on the bleachers outside the training bay, letting the Missouri heat settle around us. I told her what no one had told me when I was her age, that strength is not absorbing every blow without complaint, that resilience is not silence, and that loyalty never requires self-destruction. She listened with an intensity that reminded me of how hungry I once was for guidance that went beyond tactics and drills. Over the next weeks, my trainees grew more confident, and I grew more certain that this was exactly where I was meant to be. I was still healing, but for the first time that healing felt purposeful. The very experiences that had once isolated me were now becoming tools I could use to help others navigate their own storms. Elias noticed the change, too. He never missed the subtle way my shoulders eased when I talked about work, or the way I no longer paused before making long-term plans. One evening after dinner, he watched me as I sorted through next week's training schedules and said, "You carry yourself differently now. lighter but stronger. I smiled because I felt it too. In therapy, I had begun exploring not just the damage of my past, but the parts of myself that had survived it, the steady core that military life had strengthened, but family life had tried to break. And now, that core was finally rising to the surface. There were still hard days, days when an old memory resurfaced, or when a letter from my father appeared in my mailbox only to be placed unopened into a drawer. But those moments no longer defined me. They no longer dictated how I spoke, how I felt, or how I led. The confidence that returned was not the brittle, rigid kind I used to armor myself with. It was deeper, more rooted a quiet certainty that I had reclaimed the pieces of myself, once scattered by fear and manipulation. During a graduation ceremony for a new MP cycle, I stood at attention watching my trainees receive their badges. Martinez caught my eye from across the formation and nodded a small gesture, but one filled with gratitude and recognition. In that moment, I felt something powerful hum through me, not pride exactly, but purpose. My past had not broken me. It had forged something in me that I was finally learning to trust. As the ceremony ended and applause filled the air, I stood tall, knowing with absolute clarity that this new strength was not temporary. It was the foundation for the life I was building day by day with intention and without apology. One quiet evening in late August, after a long week of training cycles and counseling sessions that pushed me deeper into places I had avoided for years, I found myself standing alone in the small bathroom of our on-post house with the overhead light casting a soft glow across the mirror. The air was warm from the shower and faint steam curled around my shoulders as I reached up and slowly unwound the light scarf I still wore out of habit more than necessity. The fabric slipped through my fingers and fell onto the counter, and for the first time in months, I looked at my reflection without bracing for impact. My hair had started growing back in uneven, soft waves, barely an inch long, but enough to frame the outline of my face. I ran my fingers through it, feeling the gentle resistance of new growth, and something inside me loosened. It was not the hair itself that made my throat tighten, but what it represented: the slow, steady return of something stolen, the reclaiming of a part of myself I thought I had lost forever on that morning in Lebanon, Missouri. I leaned closer to the mirror, studying the woman staring back at me. Her gaze was calm, her expression steady. There were faint lines of fatigue, but they carried no shame. Only the story of someone who had fought her way out of a storm and now stood in the quiet after, in no rush to fill the silence. I was so focused on the reflection that I did not hear Elias step into the doorway until I saw his in the mirror. He moved behind me without a word, wrapping his arms gently around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there watching the reflection of us together in that soft bathroom light. Then Elias whispered, "You know it is growing back beautifully." I felt a small laugh escape me, the kind that comes from deep recognition rather than amusement. "It is just hair," I said, though the softness in my voice betrayed the truth. His hands tightened around my waist in the gentlest way. "Tessa, your hair will grow back again and again for the rest of your life. But the strength you found this year, no one will ever be able to take from you again." The words settled over me like warm water sinking into the places that had ached for so long. I closed my eyes, breathing in the certainty of his presence, the steadiness that had carried me through the hardest year of my life. When I opened them again, I looked directly at my reflection and saw something new: a quiet victory. Not the dramatic triumphs people imagine when they think of revenge or justice. Not the explosive relief of a courtroom ruling or the tense release of a confrontation finally won. This was something different. This victory was gentle and personal. It was the moment I realized I no longer flinched when thinking of Kyle. I no longer shrank when imagining my father's voice twisting my choices into accusations. I no longer felt responsible for the cracks in a family I had spent my entire life trying to hold together alone. I had stepped away from them, and my world had not collapsed. Instead, it had expanded. In the months since the court ruling, I had begun reclaiming small joys I once overlooked: the calm of an early morning run, the rhythm of trainees' boots hitting the pavement, the quiet pride of seeing young MPs learn to trust themselves, the warmth of sitting beside Elias on the couch while the Missouri sunset spilled through the window. Healing had arrived in moments so ordinary I almost missed them, but standing there in the mirror, they lined up like small lanterns marking the path I had walked to get here. Elias pressed a kiss to the top of my head and murmured, "I am proud of you. Not for surviving, for choosing yourself." I let out a breath that trembled but did not break and leaned back against him, letting his strength hold mine for a moment. Then I met my own eyes in the mirror again, and the woman looking back was no longer the bride who woke up bald and broken. She was someone rebuilt, someone steady, someone whole. And in that quiet bathroom wrapped in Elias' arms with new hair soft beneath his hand, I finally understood that this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. In the months that followed the courtroom ruling and the long, slow healing that came after I found myself returning to one truth over and over again, a truth that once terrified me but now sits at the center of every choice I make. You can love your family without letting them destroy your life. It took me 31 years to understand that loving someone does not mean sacrificing your dignity to them or allowing them to rewrite your worth in their voice. For so long, I believed that loyalty meant silence, that keeping the peace meant absorbing every blow and swallowing every insult until my sense of self felt thin enough to tear. I thought that holding the family together was my responsibility because that is what daughters do and what older sisters do and what girls raised in houses built on uneven ground are taught to do without ever being told directly. But standing in that bathroom with the first new inch of hair on my head, or later sitting at my desk in the barracks, signing forms for the next training cycle, or even driving through the quiet Missouri backroads with Elias, hand resting warm on my knee, I realized that my family was not broken because I stopped trying. It was broken because I was the only one who ever tried. And the day I let go, the structure they had built from my silence collapsed under its own weight. That collapse was not my failure. It was my freedom. To anyone listening, especially those in their 50s and beyond, who have lived through decades of holding families together with nothing but hope and habit, I want to say something I wish someone had said to me years ago. You are allowed to step away from people who hurt you even if they share your name. You are allowed to build a life that is peaceful even if others call you selfish. You are allowed to choose healing over history, because the truth is that surviving a toxic family does not make you ungrateful. It makes you wise. Leaving does not mean you never loved them. It means you finally started loving yourself. I look back at that wedding day now, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The humiliation that Kyle tried to brand into my identity became the spark that lit everything I had been too afraid to confront. My father's refusal to hold him accountable showed me exactly how deep the dysfunction ran and exactly why I needed to walk away. The courtroom forced me to speak truths I had buried, and when Kyle fell to his knees, it was not triumph I felt, but a kind of release, like a door in my chest finally swung open and let the air in. Today, my life is not perfect, but it is honest and calm and mine. I wake up each morning without waiting for the next blow, the next guilt trip, the next accusation wrapped in disappointment. Instead, I wake to purpose routine, service peace, and a love that stands on respect rather than fear. If my story reaches even one person who has lived too long in the shadow of a family that never learned how to love without control, then every painful step was worth it. And now, I want to ask you something as we close this chapter. Have you ever lived through a toxic family dynamic that left marks no one else could see? Comment the city you are watching from. I want to know how far this story travels and how many of us have walked this quiet road toward freedom. And if you want more stories about justice and healing and the courage to stand up when standing up feels impossible, then subscribe and stay with me. We are rebuilding together one truth at a time.